Hello and welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. We're looking through some of the major news stories of the week. America, with a coalition of 5 Arab countries, launches airstrikes in Syria to target Islamic extremists. The UN holds its 69th General Assembly. Can it do more to solve the world's problems? And cheaper than a George Clooney movie, India's mission to Mars. Well, as usual, the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson joins us from New York, and the Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is in Washington. They're going to be with us right throughout the show. Question for you, Jeffrey, is this. Was the bombing that started this week right?
Well, it was a bombing that started this week. We won't know for quite a while whether it was right or wrong. But what worries me is the exit strategy. I don't know that we have one, and I think that makes everything pretty precarious.
Armstrong, was it right in your book?
Absolutely. So misguided. It further shows that we have no Middle East policy, that we don't understand the Middle East. We bombed in Iraq. We bombed in Syria. We bombed in Libya. We bombed in Afghanistan. We found ourselves bogged down. This should have happened before the lives of hundreds of thousands of people were lost. Women and children were made orphanages. We don't understand the policies there. We don't understand that this is not the way to get rid of ISIS. What you're doing, you're continuing to kill and slaughter innocent civilians. And what you're doing is creating more enemies than what we've had before. No, it makes no sense. We've learned nothing. You know what it is? Here we go again.
Well, Armstrong, hold it there a sec. We're going to try and understand why we might have done all this. Let me give you a bit more information on America's first airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Syria. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan, and Bahrain and Qatar were all involved in the strikes. Many of the fighter jets were deployed from Bahrain. Intelligence and special forces came from Qatar and Jordan, which says its air force conducted specific attacks on the positions of the terrorist organisation. Raqqa, Tal Abyad, Inisa, Tabqa, Madan in the province of Deir al-Zor, and al-Hasaka in the northeast of the country have all come under attack. Now, the Pentagon says more than 160 munitions were dropped. The Syrian city of Raqqa here, which is under Islamic State control, is one of the main areas hit. Targets including training compounds, command and control facilities, and a finance centre all being hit. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer is a CIA-trained former senior intelligence officer and now a senior fellow to the London Centre for Policy Research in Washington. Concerns, Tony Shaffer, that this isn't a wise move?
It's wise and unwise, and let me say why I say that. First, there were imminent threats that I think had to be dealt with. The Khorasan group was a legitimate threat from everything I'm hearing. The ISIS organization was continuing to push people who have lived in the same place for thousands of years, pushing them into refugee status across the border into Turkey. So while I think it was necessary for us to act via airstrikes, I think we are completely lacking both a short-term policy for dealing with the regional instability, which, by the way, we've helped create, the United States helped create by essentially coming at Assad at a time that if you don't have a replacement for Assad, you're leaving ungoverned space. That ungoverned space is filled rapidly by groups such as ISIS. And secondly, we don't have a long-term understanding or strategy of what to do about the overall Middle East. That includes everything from Algeria to Libya to Egypt and all that. So there are some real issues that have to be sorted still.
Well, I'll bring the other guys in just a moment. But Tony Shaffer, that's the worry here, isn't it? I mean, there's talk of exit strategy. There's talk of wisdom of how do you finish what you started. What's your take?
Well, we don't have it. I always say begin with the end in mind. What exactly do you want to try to achieve? You may not get there, but at least you have an understanding of how you're going to approach it. And the other issue, which we have not really addressed in any substantial way, is Hezbollah and the Iranians, because right now there's great concern by certain folks in the Middle East that we may be, while partnering with the Iranians in some way, that will actually prop up Assad as being one of the allies of the Iranians, as well as the fact that we could destabilize things further by the fact you have this Sunni-Shia conflict, which now we're stepping in the middle of. So again, unless we really have an understanding of what we're trying to achieve, the simply blooding the nose of ISIS as we've done the last couple of days is not a sufficient answer. And frankly, the whole thing could rapidly go out of control if we don't have an understanding of what we're trying to achieve.
Jeffrey Robinson, that has to be a worry, doesn't it? That Obama started something he just doesn't know how to finish.
Well, George Bush started something that none of us know how to finish. The point is, I agree with Colonel Schaefer, and I mean, I served in the military a long time ago as an officer in the Air Force, and one of the things that you learn in the military is always plan for a worst case scenario. And I just get the feeling, the hunch that nobody has sat down and said, what's the worst case and what do we do if it arrives? I just think we're flying blind here, and that's very worrying.
Armstrong?
Well, you know, there are two concerns. The United States cannot resolve the Sunni-Shia strife in Iraq. And the other problem is, and this is a key word, and I think the colonel touched on it, but he didn't go far enough. This is the key word. We don't have a reliable ally in Syria. And the other point is, the lesson that you have to learn in the Middle East is that the devil you know is better than the devil you probably get to know, which means while Assad, in the eyes of this Obama administration, may be to them the worst of the worst, we have no idea what that is until we decide what we have when we replace him. No different than what we try to do in Iraq, what we try to do in Libya. It has not worked. And we don't even understand the politics of it all that exists there. We like to react. Remember, President Obama said 2 weeks ago that he had no strategy for containing and dealing with ISIS. How all of a sudden our media is showing this brave new world of this president. He has all the ideas, all the structure, and what we're going to do within 2 weeks. It just doesn't add up. It's a joke. It's embarrassing. Until we
Armstrong,
get a reliable ally in Syria, it's not going to change.
Armstrong, he did use the word yet. He didn't have a strategy yet. They worked on it. They came up with one. But the point is doing nothing is unacceptable. And doing something may very well mean that you're always doing the wrong thing. It's the old rock and a hard place.
Tony Schaefer, do we buy into this idea that doing nothing is unacceptable? Do you buy the claims of the British Prime Minister that these people represent a threat to Britons, to Europeans, to Americans at home?
ISIS is, I think, much more effective than al-Qaeda by the fact that it understands us. It understands the West. It understands how to use media, social media, effectively in messaging, both for purposes of terrorizing and recruiting. Right now, my understanding is, you can confirm this, I believe I've been told that the recruitment of ISIS in England is actually higher than recruitment for the British military at this point. So that's a bit frightening. So when you have Westerners joining this cause, the chances of two things happening are very good. First, they'll be radicalized, trained, and come back into the countries which they come from and actually conduct acts of terror. The Australians just took down a cell of ISIS folks recently, within the last week. And then the other thing is obviously credible threats regarding transportation. The Khorasan group was actually doing that. So I don't think doing nothing was the answer. With that said, we have to pick and choose very carefully how we move forward. I do a lot of media regarding the Middle East. I do Al-Hura TV and some other outlets, and I talk to those folks who are from that region. And per the conversation, the devil you know in the case of Assad is much better than the one you don't know. And I think most folks recognize that simply pushing Assad out without understanding who's going to fill that vacuum, what's going to fill that vacuum, is not the right answer.
So Armstrong, doing nothing is not an option, right?
You know, doing nothing is not an option. And also, while we discuss the fact that ISIS is really a bad group, just to have these terrorists just drive along in vehicles and just shoot innocent people out of the window of their car to make a statement, we're better than worse than anybody else. And then also, I don't think you can overlook the fact that Al-Qaeda has disassociated themselves from ISIS, and they talk about how terrible and how deadly and devastating this group is. And this is coming from Al-Qaeda, and you look at some of the practices they have in place. But then you also now you have this new group that is popping up. I think it's Khorasan that's popping up. And now they're saying this group could be worse than ISIS. So how we define bad to worse is still something for the eye of the person giving the definition.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, one of the things that Al-Qaeda did, and they were very clever about this, when we started destroying their control and command, they exported Al-Qaeda as a battle cry. And that's what it became. And any crazy anywhere in the world could do anything he wanted in the name of Al-Qaeda. And I think that's one of the things that ISIS is doing very well. They understand that you can export the slogan, you can export the battle cry. And I think that's what you found in Australia. I think that's what you're finding in a lot of places, that they are, as the Colonel said, very media savvy. Their one weakness may be money. Now, they rob banks, we know that, and they loot. But this idea of the oil connection with Turkey, that can be shut off, and it should be shut off. And their finances can be, you follow the money, and the finances can be seized where it is in the West and things like that. And that's something that I don't know is being done.
But, Tony Shaffer, when you turn to your the other contacts you have in the Middle East, do they want the West to do something? Or do they actually say, just leave these people alone, OK, we know where they are, they're going to do occasional bad things, but it's containable?
No, strangely enough, I think Qatar, who I think clandestinely helped fund the ISIS beginning, I don't think it was ISIS when they started, and Saudi Arabia. Not necessarily the governments of those countries, but families, the people who are close to the government, very rich, have helped finance all of this. So we've got to get to the root of the financing. We've got to change the way that's done. I've argued, as a matter of fact, we're having a conference call later today with members of Congress and the media, and Bud McFarlane, President Reagan's national security advisor, is joining us. We're going to be talking about the fact that we need to find a way forward where we don't be the ones, we the West do not be the ones going in with boots on the ground. One of our proposals, as we're putting forward, is let's help the Arabs organize into a NATO type organization. Now, NATO arguably has been very effective in helping Europe modernize and stabilize. So the idea is to bring something like that for them to work themselves. We, the British, French, the Americans, we will help them, but this is really on them to resolve. And I think right now, in many ways, there's a developing have and have-nots more than Sunni Shia. You have those who have resources, who are in the governance, which are essentially the devils we know. And using the South Korean example, I think you can moderate and push these governance towards democracy. I don't think you can have it all at once. So I think this is the better format in helping them organize to have their own military and civil military organization, rather than us every 10 years putting together a coalition to go in and do the military operations, which we're now contemplating for Iraq and Syria.
Jeffrey's nodding, Armstrong. Do you agree with him?
Absolutely. Do I agree with him? Absolutely, 100%. The future of that region is the Middle Easterners taking care of themselves.
Armstrong.
I think what is a little baffling to me, I mean, you think about the countries that have joined with the United States in this airstrike, and those who seem to embrace what we're doing, which we're saying is different now. Some of these countries, I mean, fully embrace and espouse and support the ideology of ISIS and Hamas and Al-Qaeda, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia among the leaders of them. And primarily, to me, this is window dressing. I mean, they may give material support, but it's a double game. They on the one hand, Qatar may do something that support us and the allies, and the other side, they're absolutely against us, and they're doing more of the latter. This is generally a problem, because the very people that we're now calling allies are the reasons why these groups that we're fighting are so well funded, and they have these blind allegiances, and their loyalties are certainly not to us. It is only if their self-interest is threatened. So how do we get in bed, and how do we negotiate with them?
OK, rhetorical questions, I think, for the moment. Armstrong, Jeffrey, and Tony Shaffer, thank you all very much. Well, as the US was coordinating the attacks on Islamic State in Syria, some of the 140 heads of state and government were at the United Nations in New York for a conference on climate change and, of course, the United Nations General Assembly. Yes, it's a great forum for leaders, foreign ministers and ambassadors of 193 countries to be heard. And here is a fascinating fact. Just 3 states are not members, and they are Kosovo, Taiwan and the Vatican. But how do you make it a more effective institution? Well, let's speak to the Executive Director of the United Nations Association, That's Natalie Samarasinghe. Natalie, how do you make the UN even better than it is today?
I think the first thing to say is that, as you said, the UN is already a very effective organization. It provides life-saving support to millions around the world, and it tackles issues ranging from human rights to health. I think often when we focus on the UN and how to make it better, we inevitably start talking about the Security Council and what those 15 governments, in particular its 5 permanent members, can or cannot do. And of course, the Security Council is an important area of UN reform in terms of the UN's legitimacy and its ability to solve the biggest problems we face. Unfortunately, I don't think any of the big ticket reforms, such as expanding the permanent membership of the Council or transforming the veto, are really going to be possible in the foreseeable future.
Really?
So,
Just explain to me why that, because in many ways the shorthand for the UN is you don't get anything done that Russia or China doesn't want to have done.
Well, again, I think it's important to remember that the Security Council has actually been able to take effective action. It failed miserably in terms of protecting civilians in Syria. However, it was able to remove chemical weapons.
Let me bring in Jeffrey Robinson and Armstrong Williams at that point. Armstrong Williams, is the UN a success story?
It's more of a source of world problems than a solution. No disrespect to Natalie. It's run by very bad actors. You got the Iranians, you got this Islamic cooperation group, which has about 57 Muslim nations, and all they do is use that institution as one big attack fest against Israel and the United States. They've lost their purpose, they've lost their guidelines, they're bringing in all these different actors from Africa and other places. They have their own interests. They feel America's had too much influence. They're trying to diminish that influence. They think we support Israel so too much. Many of these groups are part of the UN now are so anti-Israel, it's almost pathetic. I mean, it's almost embarrassing to say that the UN, and I'm sure that any organization can do it some good, they've lost their standard and much of their credibility.
Jeffrey?
Wow, Armstrong, come to New York. I'll take you over there and show you the real United Nations. It is
I need
a
to see it.
theater. It is absolutely a theater. There are good actors and bad actors. It does some wonderful work. I mean, UNICEF is a terrific organization, and it gets bogged down in politics and bureaucracy. That's absolutely true. But I always look at the UN kind of like my grandma's minestrone soup when I had a cold as a kid. It may not help, but it can't hurt.
Armstrong, in your condemnation, do you then deny all the good work it does in terms of there are people alive today who might have died had it not been for the extensive feeding programme or the healthcare that's been spread around the world? I mean, you can't deny that's good works, isn't it?
And that's because of the generosity of countries like ours that continue to support and carry much of its budget. Yes, you can deny that they do a lot of good, but I'm
If I can just come in here,
no, if I can answer, let me just answer. Listen, let me just answer. No, sorry. Yeah, listen, yes, they do some good, but for the most part, they have been hijacked by these Islamic extremists who hate the United States and Israel, and the United Nations find themselves not only conflicted, but doing their incredible bidding.
We need to let Natalie come in here. Natalie?
I was going to say, I mean, I think it's important to remember who we're talking about when we say the UN. There's no they. They haven't been taken over by anyone. The UN is made up of governments, including the United States, including the United Kingdom. It's 193 governments, like you said in your introduction. So it's not a case of them being taken over by anything. I think the crucial thing, what you asked me at the beginning, how to make the UN more effective, it's political will. It's all countries agreeing to give the UN the mandate, the support, the energy, and the funding it needs, because ultimately it is the member states who call the shots at the UN. There's no separate body that exists. That is what would make it more effective. And the second thing, I think, is improving the UN's leadership. I think we've had some great leaders in the past. I think this week Ban Ki-moon has been able to really galvanize action on climate and addressing Ebola. But ultimately, I think we've been fortunate to have good leaders at the UN. One thing that's really appalling and out of date at the UN is the process for selecting its leader. There's no job description, there's no timetable, there's no vetting of candidates, there's no opportunities for public hearings. So I think if you were to ask me what is the single most thing that could make the UN effective, firstly, political will by states, and secondly, a better process to select a leader who will be skilled enough and have a strong enough mandate.
Jeffrey,
and
would you agree with those two moves?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I don't condemn the UN. What Armstrong is talking about is all the theater that goes on with certain blocks inside the General Assembly. They make a lot of noise. They get some media attention, and they're mostly disregarded. They don't have the thing. It all happens in the Security Council. Interestingly enough, when you talk about leaders, there was a time not too long ago when they were thinking about a leader, and it was decided no, that they could never have an American leader. And I think that this particular man would have taken the job and might have been brilliant at it. We'll never know, but it was Bill Clinton. And I think Bill Clinton, as Secretary General of the United Nations, would have gotten some real action done.
Okay, let's put that to Armstrong. Would you vote for that, Bill Clinton, Secretary General?
Listen, I would vote for anybody who's willing to lead instead of being led.
One of the former ambassadors there, John Bolton, famously made the remark, I think it was probably quite serious, so he may have been being glib, that it's, of course, a massive building, isn't it? And they say you could take 10 floors out of it and nobody would notice.
I think it's very easy for us to sit here, you know, from the relative safety of where we are and say, oh, the UN isn't making a difference. I think if you live in a country where a UN peacekeeper, a UN health program or an education program could make all the difference to your life, could save your life, I think your perspective is very different. And I think the successive American governments and the American public have recognized it as well. This administration, the previous administration, they go back to the Security Council to get action on terrorism. There's a reason why the American public has confidence in successive polls about UN action.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they do some wonderful work. Of course, we as Americans don't always pay our dues at the UN, and I think we still owe them money. But I think where Armstrong and I will agree is that it is a huge bureaucracy, and like all huge bureaucracies, there's an enormous amount of waste and an enormous amount of wasted energy. And I don't know any way around it because you've got 197 nations and a lot of people representing each nation. It's not a very efficient body, but when it does something, as it does with UNICEF and feeding children, it does it very well.
I think that's something that
Jeffrey
we all
Armstrong,
agree.
thank you very much indeed. And Natalie, thank you for being with us as well.
Thank you.
Now, India has successfully put its first satellite into orbit around Mars. The Mars Orbiter mission sees India join the US, the European Space Agency and the former Soviet Union in the elite club of deep space explorers, and all at a bargain basement price. India's Orbiter mission cost around $70 million. That's less than the George Clooney movie Gravity, which came in at $100 million. Sky's Joe Tidy reports.
Making it to Mars is a huge achievement for any space agency. And by putting a probe into orbit, the Indians have become part of an elite group of explorers. Not only that, they've also created the world's first no-frills, low-cost space agency.
History has been created today. We have dared to reach out into the unknown and have achieved the near impossible.
In its closest orbit, Mars is almost 35 million miles away, but the Mangalyaan probe travelled more than 420 million miles to align with the red planet. It took 300 days but cost just £45 million. Compare that to NASA's latest mission to put a probe in orbit, which cost £409 million. Some have criticised the money that the Indian government spends on its space programme, when so many of its 1.2 billion people are poor. But Delhi argues that success in space will boost India's space industry and make money in the long run.
Well, now, while you're still here, Natalie, what about a space programme sponsored by the United Nations? Was that something they could take on?
Well, I would absolutely love to see a UN Blue branded space fleet, but I'm not sure it would be in my list of priorities for the UN to tackle. There is a UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. It does things such as provide training to developing countries on space issues, tracks the number of objects in space, and looks at how satellite imagery could be used to respond to crises. So another UN agency that probably most people don't know about.
What about the US being left behind in the space race, Armstrong? Does that matter?
It does matter. We should be much more active in space, and we should not concede any ground. What India is doing is very impressive, less expensive, and is actually pressing forward with a space program, not only for India, but the Chinese, the Japanese, its military, as well as civilians. And so we at this moment can't get into space without the Russians' help, especially for man's purposes. And so it's a serious problem. And against this backdrop, what it does, it demonstrates an intense interest in dominating space as a military domain. And the United States, I know we've cut our space program, but I think we need to reconsider this. I think America has no idea the price it will pay in the long run.
Jeffrey, do you think we should be worried?
Yeah, well, I agree there with Armstrong. And the United Nations, by the way, also does wonderful work with space law and trying to establish space law. But the Indian program, you have to understand what they're really doing. And I have this on very good authority that they want to go into space to set up the first intercontinental, intergalactical chain of curry takeouts.
Jeffrey, Armstrong, Natalie, thank you all very much indeed. And that's it for the debate for this week. Until next time, goodbye.